No, I lost that title.
You lost that title?
Yeah,
you
just
all
go
your
count
pockets? All right, so you
I think, I don't know. I don't know if I ever got up there.
well, whatever he is, he's one of our more creative types, and he's got a problem he wants to talk to you about. Back over there is our Vice President of Security.
Eric Rose and Shane Huntley from our threat analysis.
Okay, that's Eric. And oh, you brought some more people. Okay, super. All right, so I've kind of prepared these folks for the possibility that you had a challenge for us to consider to figure out whether the technology we've been talking about would even be useful and applicable. So it's all yours.
Thank you. Hey, thank you very much, Vint, and thanks to all of you for coming here today and yesterday. Yes. The reason I'm here is actually I was just chatting yesterday with Vint. I ran into him and I posed to him a problem. And it was, what if you had to reinvent the internet today with a few new constraints or principles? And I threw out the following principles. One is that you have to have no central points of failure. And so things like IP and DNS and BGP, those are all pretty centrally controlled, and those are all sort of points of failure, or sometimes corruption, and so forth. And so assume you can't have anything like that. The second assumption is, let's assume we want people to have a significant economic incentive to grow this network, to make sure that it's fast, it's reliable, has high bandwidth, and so forth. And lastly, you want to assume that everything is going to be hostile. Like, there are going to be malicious actors, they'll try to impersonate others, they'll try to have denial of service, things like that. And those two things happen to be kind of the state of the world today, as we see them in many ways. In that there are sort of a lot of central threats of disruption, and there are in many cases a number of malicious entities. And from an economic point of view, it's hard to be kind of a little guy today that just adds this particular link from here to there and expect to be reasonably compensated without doing big deals, pairing arrangements, and so forth. So I threw out that idea, and he said, well, I just happen to have 100 of the best people in the world who've been discussing, roughly that problem. And it sounds to me like you have been discussing very similar problems. I also mentioned that we'll consider that this network can also get totally severed, and we'd still like it to do something kind of useful. So I posed those questions, and I also have a rough idea of how I think such a thing might work in my mind, but only very crudely, and it might be the wrong answer. But I imagine that you really want to address things just by their public key. So you're kind of sending from one public key to another public key. And all your messages you sign. And so you know that this piece of data came from at least somebody who has that private key. The question of, well, how do you do addressing and so forth, how do you figure out who somebody's public key is? I think I kind of punted that. I assume it's sort of out of band, or upon first incantation, the way SSH works, for example. The first time you hit a machine, typically it'll say, do you accept this key? And then you say yes, and then if it changes, you get an alert. So there are different ways to do that. We can even, one of the cool things is while sort of the global internet is functioning, we can deploy things to people. Like we could put in Google Contacts. We could say, everybody gets to share their public key, and we'll put that in your contacts. Now, if it ever changes in the future, presumably something should alert you to that, and you should be suspicious. So that's addressing. In terms of sort of routing and so forth, I imagine that at any point in time, we'd be sitting here in this room, and you guys can see there's Google Guest here, and maybe that's real, maybe that's not, maybe that's any one of you has put up a fake access point that's called Google Guest. Maybe there's some others, but ultimately you want to fetch some piece of data or send some piece of data, and you just say there's some way you trigger that. You kind of decide who you're going to trust. There's some kind of payment associated with that, which could be sort of, doesn't have to be a specific payment. Maybe you participate in some kind of network pass, and some other entity kind of arbitrates for you, and you have a signed authentication that you're a card-carrying member of this entity that will pay for your access. Anyway, there's some kind of trust issue that data is going to be routed and somebody's going to pay for it. And in some cases, for us here, we might say like, oh, we don't care, it'll be free, so we don't even worry about that for the X. So we pay. But whatever data you get back is always signed, so you know that your request actually went where you intended and came back. Anyway, there's a lot of thought of different ideas about how you could make sure people feel incented and they get rewarded for providing links, especially in high demand areas, and can put ones up quickly for redundancy or in case of failure, and that there's a big economic incentive to do that. So that's roughly kind of what I posed to Vint, and he said, we're talking about roughly that here. You guys also have the added challenges of very long latencies when you're talking about interplanetary networks and so forth. So you have in some ways a harder problem. But it seems like you're thinking about a lot of the same issues. So I just wanted to get a chance to pose that out here. I don't want to disrupt too much of yours. I know you're going through your breakout groups, but I'd love to hear a few thoughts.
I think this is worth at least a little bit of time to kick around. First of all, imagine for just a moment that the scenario is that you've just generated your public and private key pair, brand new, random, never existed before, and now you want to be part of the network, so you have to announce yourself somehow. You have to register, and it's conceivable that part of the registration might be the hook on which you deal with some micropayment or something, but maybe. But there is a registration process because somehow we have to find you. You want it to be possible.
But it doesn't have to be a central registration. In the sense
No. This is a local effect.
Yeah.
This is where
I'm here. This is my public key. Right. You can get to me this way.
Now there is an analog of this, and I hope that nobody levitates out of their seats. But this is the moral equivalent of roaming, because what happens is your SIM chip is used to figure out whether you're a legitimate roamer. And you get assigned some local ID so you can be routed to in the process of registration. I'm not suggesting we should go replicate roaming necessarily, but this notion of registration in order to be discovered is not an unusual idea. There is a question about how you find out about anybody else that you want to communicate with, because all you have to address the other party is a public key. So the implication of this is flat space, which, by the way, is what SIM chips are, but they get bound to a hierarchical routing structure. So now we got endpoint IDs versus routing structures, and that should sound familiar to some of this. And finally, and I'll shut up, is that this could be explored as an overlay, which is what we've done with the DTN. It's an overlay sort of structure. So you could experiment with these ideas and try different things out in an overlay environment, and if it worked, you can imagine the overlay beginning to propagate throughout the system. You had your hand up. No, actually, so did you, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean,
Stephen Farrell. You should say who you are, by the way.
Stephen Farrell from Trinity College. I mean, there are ways to, if you're trying to route two keys, or using keys as sources and destinations, with a bit of work, you can, because a lot of public keys have structure, right?
Yes.
And you can embed, like in an RSA public key, you can embed in the modulus any string you want. Now, there's a bit of work that would be required. I don't think anybody's ever seriously looked at it. But you can put any string in the higher order bits of that, just make them longer. They still work as a key.
That's certainly true.
So if you were going to route on keys, you could put some hierarchy into the higher order bits of the modulus of an RSA key anyway.
Well, I think one little trick of it is you do want to be able to move around.
Oh, yeah.
So you're saying use that for hierarchy. I don't strictly speaking that hierarchy is necessary. I mean, if you assume there are, I don't know, say billions or trillion of sort of these endpoints, it's not that hard. I mean, there could be many entities that just keep a complete table.
the question is who has to have that table? If everybody has to have the table for some value of everybody, then that's a different.
No, I don't think everybody, but you have to, you want to get to your nearest sort of big entity that knows, or you have it cached already. I mean, I think switches do that. I mean, Layer 2 stuff does this already, no? I don't know how
To get to the shortest path, you have to have one entry for every destination. But if you don't have shortest, though, I'm Kevin Fall from Qualcomm. There's a stretch measure, right? So how many hops do you take as divided by the optimal path you can take? And so if you have like root n table sizes or something, there are compact routing results that say you can scale to these huge numbers and have modest sized tables. Even more interesting was the result that you don't have to have any predefined string arrangement in the names in order to do that. The problem of this is the dynamic cases where you were moving a lot not really worked out so much, but the result that you bound at stretch 3 in typical stretches we saw in some internet measurements were a lot more near 1, which is pretty interesting. Work with these kind of schemes.
And can't you just, I mean, your first kind of packet, if you will, might take slightly longer route.
We did a piece of work just like that, in
You can
fact.
presumably optimize that out once you know roughly where you're going and what the intermediate hops were, and start to short circuit some of those.
Right. So if you accept that like it might be possible to do flat routing on a big scale, and you accept you have an infinite amount of space like IPv6, then you could put anything. You could put all sorts of interesting things into the address, and there's reasons to put keys. There's reasons to put combinations of identifiers between like who you are, what your platform is. If you're in an attribution type place, if you want to be in an anti-attribution type place, you sort of mix them up in different ways. But the effect, I think, related to what you said in the world of this compact routing stuff, it's those entities that it's sort of a set of spanning trees across the whole network. And you go to one, and then you sort of get on one tree, go across a certain distance of the network, and then hop off on the other side, and that gives you an overall count just because of the triangle quality of it. So this is theoretical stuff that's been developed in 6 years, last 5, 6, 7 years. And it looks pretty promising, but it's not done yet.
So
that sounds really intriguing.
So on the assumption that you can solve the how do I get from where I am to where I want to go problem, the basic mechanisms of DTN help us deal with all kinds of infirmities and breaks and delays and everything else. It occurred to me that this kind of communication could even go through a cycle where the bundle that gets generated ends up in a memory stick, and you physically move it somewhere and then plug it in, and the thing takes off again.
One of the things I've been thinking about is it would be great to be able to have cached entities that you're shipping around. And that creates an incentive for people to set up nearby caches. So this would work presumably for not encrypted stuff. But I feel like a lot of the stuff online is sort of popular and common enough, doesn't need to be encrypted. And that could both simplify things and make it work partially, even in case of network disconnection.
So it's funny, earlier today we were talking exactly about the notion of caching information inside of the forwarding nodes that are part of the system.
Right. And one of the things you have to get right is the naming, because you can't know whether you're talking about the same thing from 2 points in a cache unless it's named the equivalent way. And one of the issues has been nobody really wants that much to bite off the big global naming, it's actually document DOIs or something, right?
Yeah.
If you finally eat it, then you can enable some of these kind of things where you can take advantage of this.
Of course, the DOIs aren't semantic, right? They're just, roughly speaking, arbitrary numbers.
But they're names.
They're names.
And
yes,
they're
they are
comparable.
names. They are names.
So if you walk up and say, I have DOI,
Yeah.
and another person says, I have it too, and I like them better, I can get it from them. I don't have to get it from you, and I know they're the same thing, even though I don't know what it is.
Yes, that's identifying information.
There's a bunch of work on actually using the name as a hash of the thing, right? And then in that case, you can pick it up off the floor, and you don't care where it comes from. And it doesn't really need any key management. I mean, the problem it has is where do I find the hash?
Yeah, to relate, to look things up as categories also.
Right. I mean, that's where you kind of need some.
And you get a nice property that things change when you edit, when they get mutable.
Yeah, but you can do that with keys, but it actually, it's interesting with you guys, I guess, it calls for a search thing, right? Because you've got to translate it to something human meaningful, whether it's a string or a picture or something, into one of these hashes to verify.
Now, you also want people to be able to communicate in a way that does not expose them. So
I think anonymity is an important piece of it, but I feel like you can also layer that on top of, like if you solve for the availability, and you can't, so this thing is very resilient, can't be taken down. I feel like you can always do onion routing on top of that. I could be wrong.
So some of the, Philip Tao, JPL, so some of us sort of casually thought about things like infrastructureless networks. And one problem we sort of ran into, maybe others have solved this problem, we think we can understand how we can sort of exploit locality. Say there's a lot of individuals with mobile devices in a small area. We can sort of understand how one could easily construct a network, or one could feasibly construct a network, and how that could possibly work. But our problem was we couldn't figure out how one would come up with the possible economic incentives for the long hauls. I mean, I can conceive of a scenario where we could get someone from one part of Manhattan to talk to another person in Manhattan, but how do we get LA and Manhattan talking to each other?
Well, I'm hoping that you can get all of the kind of big players to participate. There's enough, the way the economic system works, that there's an incentive. If you add a fiber where there's a capacity crunch, that you will be able to make money on it. Now, one cool thing you can do is, this is a new network, but you still have the internet. So you can have any number of nodes that offer to route you over the internet, in order to, so if I'm going from my public key to Vince's public key, and we're on opposite sides of the world, there's going to be sort of an internet sink near me, and it's going to get offloaded to another internet sink near Vint, and we'll get to that. So you can still use the internet.
if money flowed with the objects somehow, then you'd want to be a sink where you could collect some of the money.
So
you have to spend some of it.
Bitcoin with every bundle?
It's what I should have done when we started on this, is put a little money thingy on every IP packet. And then retire, right?
Doesn't the actual, if you solve the kind of micropayments or economic angle of this, don't you kind of create a problem that gives some of the bad actors leverage over the network? So if you can make money out of it, a government with which you don't agree can pressure you.
I was going to say, Mike Kearney, NASA Marshall. Besides that, your expression of the USB stick that you plug it in and the bundle goes on its way sounds very virus-like.
It is.
So I could imagine viruses floating around and collecting money out of packets.
Right. They're going to float around anyway, right? They're going to be out there anyway.
That's true.
I think money could be a pretty powerful obstacle for governments. For example, if they want to do a denial of service attack, it actually costs a lot of money. It starts to get more complicated. I don't know. These days there's a complicated power balance between money and governments. It's not necessarily that one trumps the other way.
It also, I think, depends on. There's going to be some limit on how much effort an attacker is going to have to put in, right? Because a lot of traffic analysis will still kind of work against an awful lot of the protocols you have, kind of, unless you only fixed size PDUs all the time.
Sorry, you mean so this is for dealing with the anonymity issue, for doing stuff secretly.
Right, but not just for anonymity, but also, in fact, you can analyze a lot of TLS sessions and you can actually know what's going on.
Yeah, I kind of feel like, I don't know, I think the big thing to solve for is availability, actually, is the number one thing, and I feel like you can always, there are things like Tor and whatnot, and the problem with Tor is that it gets blocked, not that, I don't know, maybe it gets spied on too, but I'm pretty optimistic about being able to solve for kind of spying, if you can solve for availability. Most of the issues that, especially in oppressed countries, that people have is they can't actually, there are various kinds of firewalls. There are a lot of limitations on bandwidth. Look at Iran has a tiny pipe and they control it pretty actively. I feel like if you had big pipes, even if they could try to be sniffing them, I think you would figure out the crypto to make it hard for them to get much out of it. That's just a hypothesis. I could be wrong.
That's if you're worried about disclosing information, but if you're worried about the fact of your communication, then that may not be an answer.
Sorry.
If you're worried about the fact that you're
Oh, the fact that you're communicating.
which in some of those areas are very much, an issue.
Yeah, I mean, we deal with lots and lots of dissidents in various places all the time. That's not what they tend to be afraid of.
I think there's
in
a
my
hierarchy.
experience.
I'd say there's a hierarchy here too. Like, I think the integrity is probably the base level. Like, you can infer stuff about the communications, even if they can see the communications, but before you even get to thinking about that sort of inferral stuff, and from the security side, the biggest threat is probably the man in the middle, the tampering of the communications, and then being able to take people out. So, of course, we'd be worried about the integrity aspect, but the confidential aspect. But if you don't have the integrity to start with, then
Yeah, the things we see today is all these governments go after those, they'll fake the DNS, which is trivial, they'll fake IP, and they'll even co-opt certificate authorities, so they'll break SSL. It's kind of every central, basically, mechanism gets
Those are target.
Yeah, I mean, it's a software update. So software update has been used a few times in these. But
I see lots of hands in the back, so let's try the yellow shirt first.
Okay. Sorry. Phil was before me.
Okay, Phil, fire away.
Yeah, I was just going to say, traffic analysis is what they do. There's a wonderful recent TED talk people should see if you're concerned about this. A German Green Party politician gave a talk where he basically went after Deutsche Telekom, got them to dump him all of the tracking data they had for his phone. And he basically did everything he could with it they could do, which was to show who he talked to, map his networks, his motion. I mean, it's scary as hell. Okay, I would recommend anybody who's concerned about traffic analysis, who doesn't think traffic analysis is a threat, should watch this talk.
No, I believe that, but you could deal with that by, using Onion, for example.
Well, at a cost. That's until you break out of the onion or break, so eventually the pipes narrow. The way IP works, eventually you got to hand something off to an application. So if you can insert it, that's part of why people, I think, currently don't rely as much on just firewalls as they once did, because if you provide content, then at the content level, eventually the stream is narrowed down to a single thread. And that's where it seems like a lot of the attacks are taking place.
You mean like malware? Sorry, I'm just...
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely
you're an
a large area of vulnerability, no question about it. And, we do a lot of work on this to prevent that. I mean, if I had a magic solution for that, I'd be working, well, we are working on solutions to that too. But I'm also trying to address, I mean, there's also the issue, the reason that these organizations and oppressive regimes exist, in my opinion, is because there's not free flow of information. In many cases, the people sending malware might not actually exist if people worldwide were able to communicate freely. Yeah, now we know.
The assumption of a public key is that you have a private key that you're keeping really, near you, right? Typically, we protect them by a password, a passphrase, which is usually not strong. Now then, your idea is related, has some binding with that property, right? Moreover, the other problem that we have with PKI is okay, I lost or my private key has been stolen. How do I revoke my? How do you just broadcast? To the
Yeah,
others?
no, I think that's a very important question.
So, my question was, did you start thinking about those typical problems that?
So we deal with that independently, or maybe Eric, you want to say that?
Is Google going to be the repository of private keys?
Try to help get it.
You bet.
Lots of things we try to do, we store them in smart cards, so it's hard for them to steal it. We could make sure that we do the padding in the TLS so that you can't do that. We'll put layers within layers so you can't do the traffic.
We work on our client devices to help to make sure they do the crypto at a sort of hardware level, like Android devices, which don't fully support that as of yet, but I have optimism that they will.
So I just
would echo Sergey's point that there's lots of hard problems, malware, crypto, and all that. We're already working on those. We already have various ideas there. But this fundamental idea that in some places just don't have connectivity at all seems like the thing that we're currently not anywhere close to addressing, and you guys are capable of it. So we just thought it'd be cool to come on.
And also something even in the US, there are periodically threats to connectivity and various kinds of censorship that would in theory be administered at ISP levels, but doesn't necessarily need to be possible.
So there's one other thought that comes to mind. Some of you I'm sure know about Tor, which is basically a tunneling mechanism. It would be very interesting to construct an experiment running DTN, bundle protocol, over a Tor supplied path, because it bounces all over the place. You don't know what the variable delay is going to be. If we could make that work, it would be an interesting test of the resilience of the protocol if nothing else.
Running DTN over Tor or Tor over DTN?
There's some little Tor.
DTN over.
DTN over Tor.
Both are interesting.
Tor provides you TCP connection, so you already have a convergence layer for that. It should be something you could do
So I
in a
think
week.
we've sort of done that, and it seems to work.
So,
But we've done like 2 nodes over Tor. That wasn't on purpose. It was just I have that
Just
Tor
happened that
running.
way.
That's why it's so slow.
It sounded like a number of the things you asked for, or assumptions you were curious about, except for maybe everybody's hostile, was the way it was in the ARPANET. So there was not central DNS. There were, I guess it
well, no, actually,
there was
it
a host file.
It was called host.txt.
It was, but it was separate. Once it was distributed, it was independent. You were not dependent on dynamic resolution framework at that point.
Yes, that's true.
You had network 10, more or less flat. It wasn't derived from keys, but it was more or less flat. It was designed to survive a nuclear blast, right? Dynamic routing. It was all. It didn't have some of the BGP. Certainly didn't have BGP with all the weird rules associated with it. That had its issues. But changing to having everybody being hostile at the same time was, I think, exactly antithetic to the assumption at the time, right?
Yes, we assumed that people would be
Nice to
cooperative.
one another.
I think starting out with the assumption that everybody was hostile would have made it real hard to get anything to work at all. Although now looking back, I wish we'd done that. There is an issue, though. In the case of the ARPANET, it didn't scale very well for the capabilities of the time, but that's 40 years ago. So I think part of the message I take away, Sergey, is that there are parameters of economics and scale that are different now than they were before. And so architectures that would have been unthinkable are no longer crazy. And so it makes good sense to go and revisit some of these ideas.
Oh, go ahead, Scott.
I'm just Scott Burley at JPL. I'm just coming back to the point of access and connectivity, and not having the ability to get any information out at all. I think an avenue to explore there is using